what does practice management mean to you, and how have you used surgeon coaching in a practice management space?
So I think in the context of just the ebbs and flows of a clinical practice where, I mean, when I started out in my private practice, I had a sort of a part-time office manager because they were really the office manager of the practice that I was sharing office space with. And being a solo practitioner, I didn't really have one of my own other than myself. And I made a ton of the decisions, but needed more and more help and more opportunity to delegate. Transition to that person kind of becoming the practice administrator more officially for several practices. And even over the years where that person left, and then I had to deal with sort of onboarding my own person and just kind of managing employees and managing that dynamic of running a practice, not just being a surgeon in clinical practice. And I think the coach was really helpful in just kind of talking out the conversations of the issues and helped me kind of navigate my own solutions for those issues.
So I heard navigating some of those solutions. What did that process look like with the coach?
It's just the regular conversations. I think in some of the parts of this, I was probably talking to my coach it was probably once a week. And it'd be a check-in on what I was doing with my next steps moving forward, whether I had conversations that I said I was going to have, whether I was implementing some of the workflow issues that I said it was. And, sometimes the conversation was that I was on call the whole weekend and between and didn't get a lot done. But it just kept me accountable to kind of moving things forward and not being in kind of you're never going to be in a perpetual limbo state. But I think without the coach, I would have been dragging it out much longer. So it was really kind of a reflection on what had been going on, what the issues were, a conversation of what I was going to do about it, and a little back and forth in that direction, and then some steps of what I was going to take between the coaching sessions and that I was having, and like I said, just kind of repeating that cycle on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you may have been able to get there on your own, but the coach helped you speed up the process to a certain extent.
Yeah, and I think it depends on because I've been being coached for quite a few years now. I mean, I spent probably the first 15 years of my practice without a coach, and maybe the last 5 to 10 more integrating a coach. And so I would say some of those issues I probably would have stalled on for eternity and never acted on. Hopefully there weren't too many of those, but there was probably a few. And then there was others where I would have acted on them, but in a little bit my overwhelm, I probably would have either dragged it out much longer. So definitely things happened much sooner, and they probably happened sooner and better because I had sometimes a dry run of what that might look like with a conversation of someone who was objective and detached from the situation.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts from our other panelists?
Well, I think what's neat that Jeff was speaking of is it's nice to have someone that's detached and objective to a particular situation, and I think he defined practice management very well. The thing I would add is that it changes and evolves over time. So if you have a client that picks up coaching very early on in their career, perhaps it's, how do I manage my office day? How can I design my template better? And coming up with a plan with someone else to implement and try things and then get feedback on, and then again come up with a different plan based on the results of that, can be very rewarding and can help speed up the learning curve of entering practice. But then as you as your surgical practice, or not just surgical practice, but as your practice evolves and matures, perhaps you need to acquire a different set of skills. He had mentioned onboarding. Maybe you're bringing in a new partner for the first time, and you need to come up with a plan on how are you going to divide patients when they call in. Those are things that depending on your resources, your employment, or your practice situation, you may have some of those resources, but certainly they're not as detached and objective as a coach. And I'm not sure that you get, as Jeff put it, a dry run, if you will, to have a come up with that plan and then get immediate feedback to evolve that right then and there before you implement it. So I think I wholeheartedly agree with everything Jeff said. I would just maybe add that the unique thing about coaching is that some of these longer relationships can really withstand evolutions and ebbs and flows of a practice as things change.
Muyibat, anything to add?
No, I agree with everything that's been said.
And how do you use coaching, or how have you used coaching, seen coaching being used in the practice management sense?
I think it can get as specific as you want, right? There are coaches that help people specifically with efficiency or specifically with surgical skills. And then it can be as broad as you want, like practice management, right? Like practice management is a huge topic. But then there can be really specialized coaches that focus on very specific aspects of practice.
Yeah, I have a client that I can think of that I've been coaching probably for, gosh, I'm roughly guessing 4 years now, and conversations that we have pretty frequently orient around kind of the financials, depending on the time of year, what he's learning from them. And so, as a coach, I'm not an expert. I'm not the accountant. I'm not the person that really knows by any means 100% of his business model. But in the conversations, I learn about that, and I become sort of the expert in asking him questions, not the expert in his practice, and helping drive a process of guidance, thoroughness. But that client is, amazing, and just watching him do all that he does, it's pretty impressive. Sometimes it involves the hiring and onboarding of employee transition, particularly over the last few years. That's been high for a lot of people, and sometimes it's integrating other systems, again, where I don't need to be the expert in any one of them, just kind of asking him, like, what research has he done? What is his what's his process of integrating his own professional development related to running a practice? So those are examples.
So I heard a lot of reflection. I heard a lot of asking questions and guidance. This question is for any three of you. I think so often we just want answers and advice. What's the benefit in this coaching space of having someone offer guidance as opposed to advice, or ask questions and support that reflection process in this practice management space specifically, maybe?
Well, I think as Jeff said, your coach may not be the expert in your specific situation, but can help you step outside of it for a second, and by asking you questions that force you to reflect.
And I also to add on to that, I think there's power in, I mean, uh, one of the core tenets of coaching is that we don't really provide advice, right? And it's really client driven and client driven solutions. And so that's, if you want advice, that's, I guess that can be biased. That can have, we all have our own personal biases on any situation that we hear, even if we're not the expert on it. Many of us, we happy to give you our opinion, but I think what's more powerful is helping direct a client that has their own goals and their own, they have a better understanding of the situation than any of us, right? Is even the best of coaches, we ask the best questions we can to understand and explore the situation. We still don't quite get it the way that a client does, right? It's their situation. So by helping guide them to a solution, I guess intuitively, whatever solution that or idea or plan that is devised has to be better than any sort of plan or advice given from somebody else that doesn't quite understand the situation to the same degree as the client. And essentially it was a one-way, when you give advice, it's essentially a one-way street. I asked you for something, I gave you something. I think that the bi-directional communication that's client driven has to yield better results than the other way.
Yeah, I think the risk of giving advice is that you might actually be right. But if there's something unique about that person's particular situation that you actually would be wrong in following that advice, then you're actually just leading them down the wrong path. And people, it's not all trial and error. What you're trying to do is you can share best practices, you can share something that's worked for you, but you're not saying just because it worked for me, it's going to work for you. And those two-way conversations that Thai is talking about create like an understanding of where they're at and their knowledge in that space. It also gives them a sense of your knowledge, so they know how to filter the feedback that you're giving them. And I would say an incredibly frequent amount of time, the client just is very appreciative of what they've done to be at the point that they're at, and then noticing what they think their additional learning needs to be. And that creates that sort of self-directed component for them to then move forward in that path. And there's a lot of science behind that's actually where adult learning and adult growth is more powerful.
Any other thoughts from our panelists?
Well, I would just make the comment of what Muyibat was saying. Like there are coaches that choose to specialize in certain areas of anything, practice management or other areas of coaching. And many of them that have a very strong coaching background versus maybe say the business they were in that then is integrating some of the coaching concepts. They tend to be very adaptable. Like my original coach was basically hired as kind of a business coach. And yet he flexes around to coach in a lot of different areas. And so your main focus may be in one area, but you don't have to feel like you have to pick the perfect specialty of that coach or the perfect topic. Like some people come to coaching not knowing whether they're looking for professional development or practice management, or whether what they're doing is some sort of transition. Like there's so many areas there. And I think a lot of coaches tend to be pretty adaptable to what the client needs. And that's one of the strengths of coaching.
Excellent. And Jeff, thank you for that segue. I'd like to change the topic now to professional development. Who would like to share one story from the professional development space, or what their perspective on professional development is in this space, in the coaching space? Because again, that can be very broad and interpreted many different ways.
Well, let me give an example that's related to actually several clients that I've worked with, and I can relate it to myself, because professional development is just kind of learning life skills, leadership skills. Can't even be, I mean, people go do professional development learning about communication and boundaries, all sorts of stuff fall kind of in that space of professional development. And I've certainly been coached on probably every single one of those. But taking a lead that Thai gave a little bit earlier, there's a lot of people that go out into clinical practice and the current model where there's very little or no coaching, and they just sort of get thrown into the fire. There's no onboarding. There's mentorship a bit, but there's kind of like, hey, just watch what everyone else is doing and just kind of repeat it. And I have a number of clients that have reached out kind of in that 3rd year, 6th year, 10th year, whenever they kind of discover that, like, that pattern of just learning on the job, everything, they're like, hey, I feel like I've done everything that I need to, and notice that what I've really been lacking to advance my career or get more control over my life and career was these other skills that I never was taught in training. And so that's, I have worked with many clients doing that. And a lot of times it's just rounding them off a bit. Like, they have through life learned a bunch of them, but there are a few they never learned, or at least they, their opinion of it is, hey, I don't think I ever learned this. And you're like, well, let me point out where you actually are already doing it, but let's go ahead and figure out where you are and move you forward.
So to piggyback what Jeff just said, I can think of an example where there was a client who kind of had a 5-year goal of being involved with a certain organization and didn't know how to get, or at least didn't have any concrete plan or thoughts on how to get from A to D. They didn't really know what B, C, and D, what all those steps would look like. And so part of it was developing a plan for, well, if you want to do this in the future, you got to start somewhere. What does that look like? And then what are the barriers to that? What are some of the tools you have at your disposal to take that first step? And then kind of mapping it out over time. And so, as Jeff said, professional development can mean a lot of things, but I constantly I referenced early careers earlier, in that when you start a new job, there's this wide open, well, what now? I've been in training most of my life. I finally have my first job. These are some of my short-term and mid-term goals. How do I get there? Another example is, and Jeff alluded to this, is some people have this skill or that skill, but maybe lack one or another. One I can think of as a client that needed some assistance in networking, something that a lot of us don't really learn about. I can say personally, those are things that maybe we just didn't spend a lot of time talking about or thinking about during our training years. But when you get out and you want to build a network or have a community of people that you can communicate with on similar topics or ideas, learning how to do that is a little bit of a skill. And so having a coach can help you develop some of those skills that maybe you weren't introduced to, or maybe you did, maybe you were, and just want to refine those in some way. So really a lot of the same things that Jeff said. I think professional development can mean a lot of different things. But those are just a couple examples that come to my mind.
Great, thanks, Ty. You mentioned creating a roadmap and working with the coach. How might creating a roadmap with a coach look different than creating a roadmap with a mentor? Because I think that's something that surgeons are very familiar with having a mentor and working with a mentor, but how might that process look a little bit different?
Well, I think that, mentorship is a relationship that has very different dynamics than coaching. So coaching is typically a neutral party that has no skin in the game other than your success. Whereas a mentor, frankly, has a conflict of interest most of the time, right? Like they're looking at your roadmap through a certain lens that may benefit them, or at the very least, it's something that they want to be associated with and are proud of, right? So they have skin in the game that's different than a coach, but it's also colored by their own bias. So if Jeff is my mentor and Jeff developed his career this way, that to Jeff is the right way to do it, right? And so then he will tell me to do that, as opposed to looking at it as a set of infinite possibilities, which I think a coach is much better at doing.
I also think that when you when you establish a mentor-mentee relationship, you're essentially saying, I want to be like you in some way, right? And that person, as Muyibat said, has a little bit of skin in the game, because it's, I mentored this person, or this person is my protege. I help bring them up in the system. I think that has a different relationship right off the bat than you have a coach where you say, I see myself going from A to B to C to D over the next several years. Let's talk about the barriers to making that happen. And oh, by the way, if I get to B and I decide that I no longer want to go to C or D, well, that's the benefit of coaching. Your relationship, your goals, your plan can all evolve. Whereas I think that just becomes a little bit different when you establish a mentor-mentee relationship up front with a certain goal in mind. It just has a different feel and flavor to it, if you will, if you want to deviate off that path somewhere in the middle.
I think also with mentor, as a mentee, when I think about it as well, even if the mentor isn't trying to do that, like there's a lot of mentor models and learning and mentorship that has improved mentorships over time in general, or maybe in specific places where they put a lot of attention to it. But as a mentee, you still make assumptions about your mentor. And so you sometimes do things that even the mentor isn't asking you to do, but you think they want. And whereas a coach, you really don't really feel that much obligation to the coach to do something that you think they want, or if that occasionally happens and you're just educating them as a coach, like, you shouldn't be trying to please me. Hopefully this is pleasing you with what you're trying to accomplish. Right. And I love what Muyibat said about infinite possibilities. It's like being incredibly flexible to the possibilities, but it's also incredibly flexible to your value and belief system, right? Instead of somebody else's. That I think coaching is way more adaptable to the client.
Now, we talked about how the mentor might be attached to the situation or attached to the outcome. There may be some bias there. I imagine the coach too the mentor wants to see the mentee to the best outcome. I imagine the coach also wants to see the coachee to the best outcome. Well, why might those two situations be a little bit different?
I think the difference is the definition of best,
Hmm.
right? Like, so the mentor wants to see their mentee get to the best outcome. They have a certain lens on that. Whereas in coaching, best is defined by the client.
That's great.
I couldn't agree more with that statement. I mean, that's exactly what I essentially was going to say. It's all about the definition there. And I think that definition is very different from the very start of the relationship. It's just different between mentees and mentors and coaching.
And I think, you know, in this conversation, we're not trying to color mentorship as a bad thing, right? Because I think there's actually bias on both sides of the relationship. So you as a mentee also have a certain amount of reverence for that mentor. Otherwise, you wouldn't have picked them, right? And both sides of that color the relationship in ways that I don't think happens in coaching as much.
Any other
Yeah.
thoughts? Go ahead, Jeff. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, same comment. Like, sometimes when we're comparing them, it sounds like we're saying one's vastly better than the other, but really we're just highlighting how they're different and what you leverage off of a coaching relationship versus a mentorship relationship. And so I think they complement anyone's career, often in the ways that both Thai and Muyibat have already explained.
Any other comments on professional development and coaching or stories?
Well, there's always tons, but we probably don't have time for all of them, right?
We'll move to our next area, which is career transition. And I think this is one that comes up relatively frequently in coaching. What are some ways you or you've seen others use coaching to benefit them in the area of career transition?
I think the hardest part about career transition is actually moving, right? Like medicine, more than probably anything, has a great deal of inertia because transitions in medicine are hard for logistics reasons, right? Like it's hard to move, it's hard to change practices, re-credential, et cetera, et cetera. I kind of went through a situation where I was being coached through this exact thing. I found myself in a position of great dissatisfaction with my career, and I was just trying to figure out how to get to a place of more fulfillment, but I also felt very stuck in my situation. And having a coach there really helped me, first of all, identify what was missing so that I can identify what I was trying to transition to. And then she helped me develop a plan to actually make that change. So I think the benefit of coaching in the situation is, one, they provide clarity because of their emotional separation from the issue. And then the second is that they provide accountability for you to actually make a plan and do it. Because the path of least resistance in medicine is really just to stay where you are, right? Like, but actually making a plan, executing a plan to make the transition can sometimes be hard to do on your own. And for me, having a coach help me through that was very, very helpful.
Yeah, sorry,
No, go ahead, Jeff, please.
So adding to that, for me, when I look back on it, it was a career transition, but I don't know that I recognized it, right? So really kind of dated back to me getting into coaching in the first place. And so what I was doing was I was in the clinical practice that felt like working 120%, 130% of the time. And the coaching ended up being a way to integrate coaching into my career as a potential exit strategy or a side interest. And So it allowed me to, rather than doing something drastic, like I'm going to just change completely in my career or go into retirement or change jobs or change my clinical focus. It was not as thought out as this is what I was going through. And I see that a lot in coaching where people are looking for something, they're not sure what it is, but it is some sort of change or transition. And so in hindsight, it allowed me to get my practice from a transition of overworking to a little bit more, I'm now working 100% of the time instead of a lot of overtime. And then over time, that's helped me evolve from a 100% clinical practice into one that is approximately an 80% clinical practice to that and 20% coaching. And I still have a longer term goal of it being much closer to 50-50. And so I'm still using coaching as a career transition.
I think this one for me, being a younger physician, haven't been in practice, been in practice for almost 5 years. This is a great example of something we touched on earlier, where your coach doesn't have to be necessarily an expert in a particular area to coach you. So I think this just highlights one of the strengths of coaching and those that undergo coach training and pick up some of the skills, but to ask the important questions of what Muyibat said. What do you want out of this? What's happening? What are your barriers? Where do you want to be, and helping identify those things. You don't necessarily have to be an expert in this. I don't have to have gone through 7 career transitions myself to help guide a client through a particularly challenging thing. As Muyibat said, medicine has a ton of inertia behind it. I mean, that's a great way to put it. So having somebody behind you that is able to ask the open-ended questions and help guide you, help you guide you essentially through this process, I think is really important. But this is definitely an area when I encounter clients, it's not something I'm an expert in, but it's something that I think through coach training and things, we can work through together.
Great.
I have just, even a very recent example where it kind of just made me think of something where, when there is that tremendous amount of inertia, a coach nudges, right? And nudging has that connotation that you're noticing what the client is really wanting to do, and it's not a push or a shove, right? And so, because that's probably more advising, or you talk to a lot of people that are reaching out for coaching, and they'll say, I talked to 3 of my friends across the country and I'm getting 3 different opinions on what I should do. And you kind of nuance, like, how are they saying it? Well, John or Mary says, you definitely need to do so-and-so. It's like, wow, how do they know that? How do they know what you should do? But as a coach, when you're nudging, it's kind of like in sort of the coaching skills that you learn or the style of doing it, you're kind of inquiring, like, what if you did so-and-so? But it's not like, hey, you should do so-and-so. And sometimes you have to point that out. Like, I'm not saying that you should do this, but like, what would happen if you did that? And you start noticing the person needs just someone to help them make the decision that they've been holding on to for several days or several weeks or several months, and you're helping them have confidence in how well they've thought things out.
To piggyback on what you just said, Jeff, I also think that the second part of that is there's also usually follow-up on that discussion, right? So you're nudging them, you're asking them to think about certain things, or maybe even do certain things. And usually there's a follow-up conversation where you revisit, well, how did that go? Or what are your thoughts now? Or when you had that conversation with so and so, what was the result? And I think the difference between coaching and advice is when someone asks me advice, I typically don't ask for feedback. I give it, and you take it or you leave it. And if you didn't take it, then, why'd you ask in the first place? You have some thought on that. So I just think it's inherently different that coaching has that feedback follow through mechanism kind of built in, because I think this particular topic, yeah, sure, there are clients that are ready to pull the trigger, and one conversation maybe opens the floodgates and things happen. But I think more commonly it's a slow progression of things. Their thoughts evolve over time, and as they take certain actions or talk about certain things, it changes. And so I think that feedback and follow through are really, really important in this space.
Absolutely.
Any other comments on career transition? I know it's really broad. It can mean a lot of different things again to each and every one of us, but any other comments from our panelists before we move on?
Just giving tiny examples, like I've coached people that were approaching and transitioning into retirement. I've coached people that were changing their clinical practice in a fairly drastic way, like either changing specialties, changing their practice model, which is actually a pretty big transition. I've even coached someone that was pretty young in their career and was transitioning out of medicine, and that wasn't me directing it. It was just going through the process that particular client needed or wanted. So just adding to our multiple examples of what a career transition might be.
Absolutely. I heard you say it's all about the client and what they need.
Yep.
So what else? What other ideas, what other areas has coaching been useful, or where have you seen coaching useful or used coaching, and what should others be thinking about?
I think the one area that maybe deserves special mention is personal development. I think a lot of us, we tend to talk about medicine is a journey, and a lot of us know how to put the work in, have studied hard or worked hard to get where we are. But I think some of the other soft skills that we along the way didn't get as much attention, and whether that's communicating with others or making time for our own personal wellness and things, those are areas where I also think coaching can be extremely beneficial. Personal wellness, I think that's an area where, at least I know I can speak from personal experience, can take a little bit of time to develop. We're so used to working, and we're good at what we're good at, but that can only get you so far. And I think that the risk of not being your best personally in time is pretty high if you don't develop some of those skills. And so I found coaching is a great way to help develop those things, and hopefully have a longer career because of that.
Yeah, I'll make a point along with kind of any one of these things, because there's topic coaching and there's kind of different ways that you coach. And so some people in the personal development are looking for ideas or brainstorming. They're looking for conversations that kind of lead them to recognizing what they're looking for. But one thing that people do in a lot of different spaces, whether it's in the operating room or it's personal development, they're basically managing habit change. And there's lots of books on this stuff. There's a lot of literature on habit change. And a lot of times as a coach, the client is actually integrating a habit. And so it's a lot like any skill development where you create the plan of what the habit's going to be and how you're going to integrate it, and then the follow-up to see how it's working. And those can overlap a lot of different skills that Thai was mentioning, and kind of made me think of it, whether it's wellness or setting boundaries or time management. There's a lot of things that fall into that space.
Okay, so I think that'll conclude our storytelling portion. What I'd like to do now is transition into a coaching demonstration. We have with us Coach Muyibat, and we have with us client Jeff. And I'll let them kind of fill you guys in here for a second. In a second here, but I think they'll set the scene. I believe they've done some previous coaching, so we're kind of picking up not at the beginning, but maybe in the middle of their coaching partnership. And with that, I'll let them set the scene. I'm going to put 10 minutes on the clock for them, so we still can share a little bit of observation and discussion afterwards. But with that, I'll let you guys start.
Hey, Muyibat, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
I'm pretty good.
So, what would you like to talk about tonight?
Well, I thought it was pretty interesting that in the cycle of all this scheduling and stuff that you and I have talked about in the past, today is actually the day that I have in my phone that pops up the reminder that says, how is Jeff doing? So that's a habit, and that came out of a conversation that you and I had that was, I think, primarily focused on this concept that I'm trying to figure out how to integrate more coaching into my career and transition to have less clinical work in my career. So I want to thank you for helping me create that habit and kind of create it in a way that became quite self-sustaining.
Remind me what the goals were that you set.
Yeah, so some of it was, I think we did it while I was recovering from my back surgery. And so I had a sort of a check-in. So that's the concept. How is Jeff doing? So the check-in that occurs every 6 weeks is, how's my back? What's the level of sciatica? How well am I doing with stretching and strengthening? And at the time it was kind of, am I allowing my back to heal or recover? And that worked well. Now I think I'm beyond the healing and recovery phase, but now I'm in the maintaining my back. And yes, there's still always issues, because even as I sit here right now, my foot is partially numb, but I'd rather have the numbness than the pain. So
I'll take it too.
And then I had kind of like I said, kind of a check-in on my trajectory of the coaching. And I think one of the questions that you helped me come up with was kind of, what do I want to be asking myself? Right. So, and it was, how am I doing? And I think there's a sense of that. Is it feel like it's in the right trajectory? Because I know it's not a snap of the fingers, right? That you can't just wish this stuff to happen. So, as I reflecting on it today, I'm very content. Definitely there's a ton of growth on the coaching side. I think probably if I were to reflect currently, I'm probably in a phase where I'm not super happy with my clinical volume because it's December and I'm in charge of a call schedule. So I've had to pick up more days than I really wanted. So I'm probably deviating from my principles for the holidays.
So that's how it feels it's going subjectively, but what about objectively? Do you have any
Yeah.
targets that will
Well,
reflect?
the objective failure is the number of call days in the month. Because that was sort of the objective measure, was getting down to probably 8 days. And in my normal trajectory, I was hovering 8 to 9, so feeling like that's pretty good success. But like I said, in the last couple of months, that's probably been 10 or 11 days.
Okay.
From a clinical volume, I think I'm managing that really well. Like, some of that's just the fortunate aspects of call not being out of control busy. But also just there's a lot of other things on the side that I've done to, pass off cases when I need, just kind of schedule them when it's gonna work both for me and the patient, versus the early part of my career where it was always like just as soon as possible to only benefit the patient and had no bearing on whether it was going to work well for me or not.
So in terms of what you're describing, your objective, I don't want to say failures, I think that's too strong. Your objective letdowns, let's say, over the past couple of months, what do you need to do to get back on track?
Yeah, it's keep moving, so I look at these as kind of longer term goals in progress of things that include sort of strategizing what things will look like 6 months or a year from now. Sometimes it's the shorter, more intermediate term, but 2023 looks really good. So I'm excited about that. So that's why I'm not really overly down about it. And what else? Restate your question for me.
What do you need to do to get back on track to where you want to be with respect to clinical volume and call?
Well, one thing that will help is that I manage 2 call schedules. So at the end of this year, I only will be managing 1. So there's kind of an unfortunate tradition that when you're in charge of the call schedule, if it's going to mess with anybody, you take the hit. So I won't be the guy taking the hit as much anymore. And then just I've raised awareness that in the general healthcare system, but even here locally, that we function in a model that is just enough physicians and surgeons and not a slight abundance. If anything, you're always often in a slight deficiency. So I've been having conversations to raise the issue that we need to figure out how to, right now it works out well, but if any one person retires, is out, like, because we've had some times where people recently have been out with COVID, and it's like, okay, see, I proved my point. Like, people are picking this up, but there's no way we could sustain this for more than the 10 days or a month. So we need a way to be able to have more people available to take call, as my particular example.
I feel like one of the challenges we've spoken about directly and indirectly, I think, is about how do you, Jeff, manage your individual goals in the context of this system that you don't control, right? Like, you've always had the challenge of trying to limit clinical volume in a situation where there's a lot of volume. I feel like this may fit in that same boat.
Yeah, and I think what you're pointing out is that I think a lot of these things have complexity, right? Like you can come up with a simple solution, act like something simple often, but there's often a reassessment of why it doesn't work. Like I've made great steps going in the right direction, and then you recognize that there's a different loophole that you weren't thinking about or expecting as to how you get tapped in. Maybe I've become really good at saying no for extra cases when I really can't handle them, but then that doesn't control the cases that come in while I'm on call. So, a lot of my practice was taking on extra cases. So I got good at that, and you recognize a new loophole to the challenge. And I'm not saying this happens all the time, but it's pretty good. It's pretty common with me that you recognize that there's other ways that lead you down the path of overworking or taking on too much. For a while, like the reason I got really good at saying no, because some things just didn't fit my passion. Well, when you create success in an area that you really enjoy doing, you all of a sudden can't use that as a criteria anymore, because a lot of things are falling on your plate that fit your passion. So you recognize, okay, I need a new plan. And Ty kind of alluded to that earlier, where I'm often making small modifications in my plan. In fact, what it's making me think is that I haven't updated my questions in a while. And so maybe my next step is to look at my little checklist of how's Jeff doing, and saying, are these really the questions that are most important for me to be reflecting on every 6 weeks?
1 minute left, Muyibat.
Okay. So that's a great point. So what do you think you need to reflect on now? Not necessarily the questions, but just the topics.
Yeah, maybe it's both. I do think it's a little bit the questions in some ways. So I think I'll do that exercise either in the next couple of days or in the next week or so. Are these the most appropriate questions that I want to ask right now? And then I think, like you said, like I think you're alluding to, is it other questions? Is it values? What were you kind of alluding to when you asked that?
Well, I was wondering, what topics do you think you need to address, right? Because I think looking at, well, what question should I ask is it's a big pool. Whereas if you think about, well, I don't need to be thinking about my back so much, but I do need to be thinking about X, whatever X.
Yeah, I think you're right. And that's kind of what was a little bit reflective in my checklist, because I was thinking, I do want to maintain my back, but is the question a little bit different? And that topic, and is the topic the percent of coaching, or is it actually something a little bit different, right? In what are my near and intermediate term goals of what I'm trying to transition to. And fortunately for me, like in my situation, I don't think it's looking to do less of, maybe there's a little bit of doing less of things that I don't like or that I'm not wanting in my career or practice right now. But I think it's more of just prioritizing the things that are on a higher level of fulfillment.
Glad you said that, because I wanted to challenge something that you said earlier. You said that when you think something is simple, it's actually more complex. But what if it's not more complex?
It's a good point. Sometimes I got to take all my complex thinking and simplify it. You're right about that. Thank you.
Well, I think that you just did, right? You said, I need to reprioritize. That's actually quite simple. I think, when we assign complexity to things, it's a way of deferring, right? If something is more difficult or more complex than I thought, then that's also something that I need to deal with later. But perhaps re-simplifying it will make it more urgent for you.
Yeah, so you're hitting some good buttons for some themes of how I recognize what I do procrastinate on. Yes. So that's a good summary point. Thank you.
So let me stop you guys there, because I think that was a very helpful coaching session in just a very short period of time. But Jeff, what just happened?
I mean, to me, like a couple things. One is we just, in a way, just had a conversation. But that conversation was very focused on Jeff, right? Me. And so it created this space for me to, within that conversation, kind of move anything forward with just little, fantastic questions from Muyibat, but me being able to stay in my space of integrating it to how I change and how I work, and not necessarily feeling like I was being directed as to how to do it. It was more like, what are you trying to do? And again, they were great questions.
And did you find that helpful?
Yeah. So, I mean, it created a awesome space of just reflecting. And then I also kind of, it helped the way Muyibat did it, or the way I kind of think about coaching. It allowed me to just kind of have a little bit of a checklist of things to do, which is really the more, this is very productive, or it's very inspiring. It's very motivating. It's very helpful in kind of assessing the goals and maybe even some of the plans. But then there's the action point, which she helped me create, like some things that I will do. And it worked really well when we did it a long time ago. And I can't imagine that this isn't going to do the same thing.
And Muyibat, what would be the follow-up process from the coach's perspective, either in the coming weeks, or before the next meeting, or in the next coaching session? What might that look like?
Yeah, I would have ended this session with an assignment for him to come up with that list of questions. And then that segues to the next session where we would follow up on that. Okay,
great.
Yeah, my sense would be that, knowing how she's done it before, it's like, what was it again that, kind of confirming my commitment. And then the follow-up is, how did it go, or how is it going? And so it's that reminder of the commitment, and then kind of holding me a bit accountable. The coach kind of has to learn a little bit about the client to know what level of accountability and prompting that they're looking for. And Muyibat's done that really well with me.
Any other thoughts or comments from our client or coach?
I think the other part that we haven't touched on is that the client does come to the situation with a certain level of desired accountability, right? So a coach is generally, a commitment, right? There's a time commitment you make to be coached. There's also a financial commitment. It's an investment. And because of that, Jeff or any other client would kind of come into it with a certain level of desire to be held accountable as well. it's not, I don't think, any of us would say the coach imposes that on the client and the client just accepts it. That's not really how it works, right? Like the client will show up to the relationship also desiring those things. So it really is a two-way relationship.
Great comments, Muyibat. Thank you. Are there any comments, questions, or observations from our attendees? Any questions? You can put them in the chat. Feel free to turn your video and mic on. Happy to receive any questions you have.
Yeah, I'd love to hear questions or comments from those that are here for the live session.
Yeah, I hope you don't mind. Thanks for doing this. This is fantastic. I just had a quick question for you. So sometimes I deal with also hospital staff as well. And a lot of it is also around sort of, the grief of losing patients or big complications. Been all through all that myself. And so I understand. And but, when do you find a line in your practice of when are you getting a little bit more into the archaeology of where they should be going to a therapist versus really able to just kind of get through that with a coach? Have you had to do that yet?
Yes. Sorry. Anyone else commenting?
Muyibat or Jeff?
Muyibat,
why don't you comment first?
I think the real line comes in what the difference is, right? Where therapy really centers on processing what's happened in the past. And coaching is really about designing action for the future. The real line to me comes when you identify depression, essentially, or a situation where a person is kind of circling around the same issue that's holding you back from taking action. So those are the clients that I kind of think would benefit more from therapy than from coaching.
Yeah, I was just going to add that a fair number of people do both. And the client figures out what's being of value in sort of a counseling, mental health, grief, whatever process. But so I, as a friend, can be supportive to a friend. I, as a professional colleague, can be supportive to somebody else going through grief or whatever, just being a human being. And so a coach can be a human being that shows compassion and empathy, and it still provides value, but it's not, the professionally trained in that particular field. And so when you recognize and you sort of offer the disclaimer at the beginning of coaching, and then you sometimes remind people of that, I'm not a counselor. I wonder if what you are looking for or needing is counseling. And if they are getting it, then hopefully you're complimenting it. And you can even pose the question, have you mentioned to your counselor that you have a coach? Because I think there's a benefit of, just like I might say, do you have a financial advisor? Because I'm not. Do you have an attorney? Because I'm not. And so I think a good coach who's following coaching ethics is recognizing where a coachee might benefit from another professional.
Great, thank you.
I just noticed as my sunset how creepy my image now starts to look.
I was going to let that go. That's all right.
I'd shine it in front of me, but I'm sure it's going to look pretty weird that way too. We'll see. Other questions?
I'll throw in one from Delaware, and again, thank you for pushing forward with the effort. My name is Brian Gallinet. I'm a private practice orthopedic surgeon in Delaware. I had another meeting for our state medical society. Sorry to be late. Muyibat and Thai, great stuff, very inspiring. As we all know, many enjoyable aspects of our life are not compensable. And so this coaching is somewhat natural to us who are givers and healers. So I guess a little reflection. How much what you do as a coach is a give, and how much is a take or a get. I mean, and the background there is, I mean, it should be compensable. I mean, there should be, for you young, knowledgeable people who understand the value. It can't be a one-way street. But just kind of reflect on that. I mean, I think every time we help somebody, we feel good. Part of our mission in life is to do that. For coaching to grow, I think it also needs to have the financial recognition of the value it provides for the coachee. So in your experience, just a couple of thoughts on that.
I guess I have experiences from both perspectives. So as a coachee, it was very important that this was a service that I paid for. And the reason for that is you pay attention to what you pay for, right? When you get free advice or free anything, it's kind of something that we all take for granted. But making the financial investment into coaching for me aligned my effort and my thoughts with the development that I was trying to do at the time. As a coach, I think you're right, it's both, right? I do want to give, but it is also compensable. One of them is, just the value of my time, but also for the client to make that investment into this process. I, as a coach, cannot impose upon the client the importance of their own development. And they've got to commit to that on their own. And I think the financial aspect of that is a reinforcement of that commitment.
Thanks. Well said. Ty, any thoughts?
Yeah, I honestly couldn't have said it any better. Again, I've said that twice tonight, and Muyibat always steals my thunder. But the truth is I think it is a two-way street. Having received coaching, you pay for it, and it's something, when you pay for it, you pay more attention to it, and it's an absolute investment in yourself. No different than for me having a gym membership. If I pay for it and I don't go, it bugs me that I paid for it, and so I have two options: I either continue it or I cancel my membership. So I absolutely agree with her that there's there is some sort of cost that is associated with this thing. I think one of the barriers, however, to coaching is that it can be somewhat expensive depending on the arrangement that you have with the company that you work with. And so I think as Muyibat said, our time should be compensated. I mean, for both of us completed coach training, and there's a fairly sizable commitment to doing that in hours and practice and things like even tonight, just being here. But it's one of those things: how do you have equitable access to these resources if they're as valuable as we say they are, and they're great for different stages of the career, perhaps even trainees, before they get into practice. How do you make it affordable for everyone in some way? How do coaches get compensated for their time and their expertise? I think that's all things that remain to be answered. And I think there's going to be a trial and error in a lot of that stuff. And I think, this is my personal opinion, I don't have any facts to prove this, but I think coaching, we're talking about it much more now than we were 5 years ago. And programs and institutions and even practices are becoming more attuned to the idea that coaching can be a value added prospect. And so it may not be incumbent on the individuals in the future to necessarily foot the entire bill for something like coaching services. Perhaps it's a practice pace for that, and client or partners or whoever can take part in that relationship. I'm not sure what it all looks like in the future. But I do, again, I think the underlying tone is, I completely agree with Muyibat. It's a two-way street. And sure, it is, especially if you look at someone like Jeff, who uses coaching in some ways as a career transition, that has to be financially feasible to make that happen. And it should be, right? Jeff's dedicated a lot of time to making this happen, and all the hours. I mean, he has more hours than me and Muyibat combined times 10 doing this. And so, those are all things that remain to be answered, I think, long story short.
Well, I appreciate your reflections, and and Paul and Jeff have heard this line of questioning from me before, but in a dream state, 1 decade, 2 decades from now, all this early effort is going to come to fruition. I'm still excited about the concept of more people understanding the nuances of coaching that comes with education, and then it propagates through helping people do a better job delivering care to patients in our particular sphere of influence. So I'm gonna keep dialing in and hope to be as knowledgeable and educated as Muyibat and Thai, and of course Jeff, at some time in the not too distant future. But we'll keep learning. And Thai, I think you're right. I don't think I find my 4th year in practice partner who's struggling with all aspects of life, looking to drop coin on, oh, I need a coach. So institutional support, large practice support, as this becomes a more understanding as to the increase joy of our practice, our opportunity to take care of people, and how we can enjoy our lives better when we have this outside influence, this unbiased sounding board. I think it makes a difference on how our careers go forward, and how our ability to take care of people is improved.
Brian, here's a theory. So I have a extended family member that's in professional sports, and any team or organization that he is hired by or paid by, whatever you want to call it, has their coaches, and he's obligated to work with those coaches, and it's part of the contractual relationship. So that's sort of the organizational coaching. He doesn't pay extra for that, right? That's how that's the team, the organization. But in off season, he works with his own coaches, because those are ones where they don't have the biases of the organization, and he pays for those. So, for some people, perhaps it's a blend. For some people, it will only be through their organization, and some people it may only be independent. I think we're going to see all of those play out over the next many years.
If fair. If I mean, my coach in college told me what to do. The whole concept of this coaching session is to allow me to, or the coach process is to help me figure out what to do. So again, we struggle a little bit with the terminology of it, but people have to understand that it's out there, that there is the opportunity to do better as a result of having a coach individually, if it's going to get widespread adoption. There'll be a continued bump because of institutional loss of productivity due to burnout, and we thankfully have more publications coming forward that will accentuate the opportunity associated with coaching. And again, look forward to continued growth of the awareness and the result.
Thanks so much. Paul, you want to close us out?
Yeah, if there are no other comments or questions or observations, I can do that. Again, thank you to Thai and Muyibat and Jeff. Thank you to all the attendees for being here tonight. We'll share this recording with everyone, and we'll be sure to do this again. So next steps, make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. Share this content, share the recording, share what you know about coaching. It's a matter of letting everyone know what this is about and what we're doing and the differences and how valuable it can be. And then, like Brian said, continue to show up, participate in this community, participate with other people in a similar space, and just continue to share the great word about coaching. So thank you everyone for being here tonight.